Wow. The presentations thus far have been wonderful, incisive, directly on point. Chairman O'Malley in particular covered considerable portion of what I might have framed in my remarks here. But with COINTELPRO, its antecedents and its descendants, it's an ongoing reality. There's far more than can be encompassed in a half an hour or a day. And because it's continuously evolving, that situation would remain. But let's say, first of all, and the word's been used by others, I think all panelists, from Chairman O'Malley and the preceding two, have all referred to counterinsurgency. So let's start with the fact that COINTELPRO, which is a cryptonym, it would be considered an acronym, except it was secret during the period of time when it was actually in use by the FBI. And it breaks down as the CO comes from counter, the INTEL comes from intelligence, PRO comes from program, counterintelligence program, which sounds kind of innocuous. It's also a misnomer. And it was innocuous on its face. One has to wonder why it had to be a cryptonym. It's because most of what came under it was technically illegal in the United States at the time. But the misnomer part has to do with the fact that counterintelligence per se is intended. There's actually a mandate for the FBI to pursue counterintelligence operations, but the mandate uses the term correctly, which is to counter the activities of agents of foreign powers, usually citizens of those powers, but not always, but nonetheless operating in behalf of foreign powers at the expense of the United States to violate security. That's espionage, sabotage, and so on. But the foreign element is what's key. Insofar as the mandate goes to nullify, to counter, and to stop the activities that come within that range, those who were targeted as operatives of foreign powers, one form or another, non-citizens for the most part, were not subject to the constitutional protections of the United States. They were suspended. The objective of counterintelligence operations was, and this is the FBI's term, to neutralize the activities of those who were targeted. Neutralize. And that can go from exposing them when they needed to be functioning in a clandestine capacity, to discrediting them if the exposure itself was not sufficient to nullify their activities, to contriving cases which might result in their incarceration, but at least tie them up in judicial processes, insofar as they were mostly of foreign extraction. They might be green card aliens, they might be landed immigrants, they might be whatever, but a non-citizen capacity, or people who had misrepresented facts of their background in gaining immigration status and had, as immigrants, become citizens. If there was that history of misrepresentation in their petition to become citizens, they could be deported, they could be incarcerated, and in particular cases, key targets might be assassinated. They were subject to forms of monitoring, surveillance, and so forth, which were prohibited. Constitutional reasons for use against citizens of the United States. Doesn't mean that the prohibition was always respected. The FBI had a long history of operating in an unwarranted manner in surveilling U.S. citizens as well as non-citizens. Black bag jobs, the burglary of their offices or homes in search of intelligence. They were not stealing valuable items. They were stealing mailing lists. They were stealing financial records. They were stealing address books. They were stealing all manner of records having to do with organizational activities or personal activities and so on. It was intelligence gathering for purposes of neutralization, all of that. Well, the reason that you had this cryptonym in effect was that COINTELPRO was the utilization of this broad range of tactics intended to destroy the effectiveness or operational capacity of the targets against the U.S. citizens, members of organizations, groups, whatever, that were considered subversive of the status quo. In other words, they were undermining white supremacy, colonial order of things, as has been described, to be categorized in that fashion by the Bureau as a citizens organization caused you to be targeted, and you were to be neutralized by whatever means were necessary within the continuum of operational tactics and so forth that defined counterintelligence against foreign powers. So you were essentially declared to be a non-citizen. You were essentially declared to be an enemy that needed to be destroyed for preservation of the existing order in the United States. And colonialism, that's been pretty well described here in prior presenters. I have really nothing that needs to be added in this context, but that's the nature of the order. It takes many forms in its ramifications, the nuances by which it affects its lives, and that's comprehensive. That's the order that's to be maintained. My grandmother used to tell me that there was a place for everything and everything should be returned to its place. Now, she was a neatness freak, but that's a sort of a cliche, turn of the phrase with which most people would be familiar. May not practice it, but they'd be familiar with the adage. In the context we're talking about here, the rule would be translated as there's a place for everyone and everyone is supposed to remain in their place. Getting out of your place, getting uppity, as the white supremacist vernacular would have it, was cause for being targeted to one extent or another. COINTELPRO, a list of tactics, would begin really with infiltration, or infiltration bringing outsiders into organizations who were either employed by as agents, police personnel or intelligence personnel inserted into organizations to gather information, or to coerce, convert, whatever means were available, active members of organizations to provide information about the functioning of organizations and individuals within the organizations to the intelligence gathering entity, in this case, the FBI. Although it should be noted that the FBI, from very early on, was constructing relationships with police personnel, police departments in all the major cities in what are conventionally referred to as red squads, although they go by various names. In New York, it was called the Bureau of Strategic Services or Special Services. I've heard it referred to as both. Gang Intelligence Unit in Chicago. Keep listing them off, but they all reduce to the term red squads. Their whole function was to deal with subversive organizations as they define them. In some cases, as those above them, political figures, corporate entities, plutocrats of one sort or another would define those to be targeted. And the basis, it was ideological, sometimes practical, more when strikes, etc., were at issue, but usually ideological, because the way you think about things defines how you comport yourself in the world. If you see your employer is ripping you off, chances are you're going to be inclined to organizing to strike. So on. Beyond that, a number of these infiltrators from the outside, and sometimes people inside would be recruited to this role as well, but seldom. It's usually infiltrators, people who were sent in, not so much to gather information, although they did that, but to disrupt the activities of the organization in various ways. And that considered rumor mongering of various sorts, raising ideological disputes. Some people trained to do this became conversant enough with the ideologies adhered to by the organizations they infiltrated that they could argue points of dialectics and so forth, endlessly disrupting, causing quarrels, causing disputes, diverting people's attention from the concrete agendas they were attempting to pursue into squabbles that would result in factionalism and a breakdown of organizations, often targeting leadership people in a number of ways, romantic interests and so forth. So-and-so is sleeping with so-and-so's wife. So-and-so's hitting on her. So-and-so's embezzling money, raking off a little bit from the fundraising to enjoy a better lifestyle. So-and-so is doing this, that, the other thing. Let's whisper. Now, don't tell me anyone where I got this, but or where you got this, but blah, 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 blah. Continuous tone, which unfortunately merges with behaviors in a number of our movements historically anyway, rivalries, personality conflicts, ego trips of various sorts, cause this sort of thing to happen anyway. It's an environment into which a good provocateur, that's what these people are functioning, agent provocateur, they can simply take what's there and ramify it, causing, in some cases, the disintegration of organizations, splits in organizations, so forth. A very famous one, the so-called Newton-Cleaver split in 1971, which arose from an ego conflict, or arose from an ideological conflict. Those things were real, but all of them were furthered by a secret mailing campaign by FBI personnel, forging letters from known Panthers to Eldridge on the one hand, to Huey Newton on the other hand, to convince each of them that the other was attempting to kill them, undermine them, assume their role in the party, become dominant, blah, 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 which ended up in a violent fracturing of the party. The Black Panther Party after 1971 was in various sorts of decline to the point where it might as well not have existed by 1975. There was something called the Black Panther Party, which was maintained by the Newton faction, I guess you could call it, in Oakland, Bay Area. Up until 1981, I believe it was, the one constructive function that it did was maintained was running a community school, which was gone by 1981 too. And then there was no more Black Panther Party in the original form, period. But it had effectively gone out of existence as a result of this kind of undermining that occurred a decade earlier, really. The next level, if you would put it as a level, begins at the same time, is utilizing media. Propaganda is always a piece of this, okay, which would seek to discredit in the public mind key organizers, key agitators was the Bureau's vernacular, as well as the organizations themselves, exposing hidden agendas that didn't exist, such as that. And the Bureau maintained a nationwide stable of what they called friendly or cooperating journalists. Often you had pieces of journalism, I'm putting quotes around that, written by FBI specialists themselves in what was called the Public Information Division of the FBI, a big one. It was one of the major components of the FBI at the time, and it was cranking out news items that these friendly journalists and others from time to time would sometimes rewrite, modify to resemble their style, but often the stylists in the word shop of the FBI were pretty good at their job, so it came out sounding like the purported authors. Often enough, Ron Koziel in Chicago, in connection with the Hampton case, which was mentioned earlier on, he simply signed his name to things that were written by the FBI, or repeat verbatim what they told him on the phone, presented as news to discredit, destabilize, ultimately to destroy the organization. So you've got that. Then you've got what's called badjacketing. And I should have mentioned this in relation to the agents provocateurs. A particularly effective means of whisper campaign was for an agent or an operative, an infiltrator, an agent provocateur, to target somebody who was well thought of, who was effective as an organizer or whatever, and start the whispering campaign to the effect that they were actually a police infiltrator themselves. So you had the agent discrediting the bona fide activist, causing him to be, him or her to be mistrusted, neutralizing their effectiveness. Okay. And you had cases where that was done, you know, one agent managing to do it to 20, 30 people within an organization. The guy in Chicago, O'Neill, who was the infiltrator who served as Fred Hampton's bodyguard, and gave him I gave the police raiders maps, gave to the FBI, who provided it to the police raiders, maps of the apartment showing where various pieces of furniture were, including Hampton's bed, which was highlighted. Then slipped Hampton a glass of Kool-Aid laced with succobarbital before the event. Then he left. He wasn't there, of course, when the raid occurred, but Hampton was basically unconscious when he was killed. The guy I worked with, Mark Clark, I don't know whether he had succobarbital slipped to him or not, but he was pulling security, was basically asleep when the attack began, so he never had a chance. They never had a chance. In fact, the one shot fired by the Panthers that night was a shotgun that Mark was holding in his lap when he was shot point blank in the chest by Gloves Davis on the way in. It was part of his death spasm, death reflex when he was hit. Bullet went essentially into the ceiling, and that was all. The rest of the 99 odd shots that were all fired by the police, including the shots that were fired into Fred Hampton and hit Verlaine Brewer and others. So, you know, this gets quite serious. Now, what happened with the Hampton raid and Clark is the top of the heap. I mentioned assassination, but before you get to assassination, they'd already worked this out on Fred Hampton as well. He had been convicted of stealing ice cream from an ice cream, basically an ice cream truck on a hot night in the park. He liberated the ice cream and handed it out to kids in the park who couldn't afford to buy it. He was given a prison sentence for that, but there had been an appeal, and so he was out on appeal when he was killed. incidentally, I'm not all that fond of the movie. I'd have to go with Chairman Amali and his analysis of it, but there was more than that. I had personal knowledge of some of the actors in this, and no, that was a sanitized thing, but it did, as was pointed out, get the conversation going and get it on some younger people's radar that Fred Hampton existed and so on. Much more powerful speaker, much more eloquent speaker, much more incisive speaker than anything that was shown in the film, but that would have made the film dangerous. Before that, you have pretext arrests, and these were used extensively, and most often by the police collaborating in these counter-subversive or counterinsurgency operations. A notable case, it was used as a template really in the operations against the Black Liberation Movement and others for the duration of COINTELPRO, was undertaken against the Revolutionary Action Movement in Philadelphia, summer of 1967. And they arrested people with no intention, no hope really of obtaining a conviction, and if they did, it would have been minor offenses, but they'd arrest them for anything on site on the street, take them to jail, then they'd have to post bond and usually mount a defense in order to be acquitted and out. But as they posted bond and started to leave the police station, they'd be arrested on an undercharge and taken right back into the jail. And by the end of the summer, you had activists, and RAM was not a large organization, but people just separating from the organization to avoid more of this harassment. You know, people who are facing 6 and 7 trials over nonsense, really. But in each case, they had to come up with bail. The organization had to come up with bail if the individual did not have it, and retain lawyers, incur legal expense, bankrupted the organization basically, and drove a number of the members out of it. And that was extolled in a lengthy memorandum by the special agent in charge of the FBI office in Philadelphia as a technique that could be replicated to good effect elsewhere. And of course it was. That was standard practice, man. You'd be hauled in and hauled in and hauled in, police coming to your door, and so on, serving warrants on things like unpaid traffic tickets, whatever. And then serious trials that could be undertaken for the same reason. They did not necessarily expect to obtain a conviction, but you could keep people tied up completely in the legal system for months, exhaust organizational funds. And so for fundraising, being used not for constructive engagement with the community and things like the Panther survival programs, but going to mount legal defenses. For Panthers at one point had 60 people facing significant criminal charges. And as we know, you know, and as was figured in the calculations of the FBI at the time, some of these are going to result in convictions. And we've got people still in prison who have done 40 years and change, 50 years in some cases. We had a guy in California, Chip Fitzgerald, an LA Panther, who went in 67 and he died within the last 6 months, still in prison. So permanent neutralization there, but you could not obtain that conviction, and the person was not deterred by other techniques down the continuum. Then assassination was an effective nullification, neutralization, if you will, of a key activist. That they were targeting Hampton, but they may also have been targeting, well, they were also targeting Bobby Rush, that is Congressman Bobby Rush, who was the defense minister of the Chicago Panthers at the time. But he'd had a familial dispute and gone home that night. Otherwise, he would have been in the apartment and he was to be taken out as well. And they may have been targeting Mark Clark for that matter, because he was being recruited into the Chicago loop of things, but he was the head of the Panthers in Peoria, which is where I worked with him. So he was a key individual in his own way. These are taken as successes. Other ways of accomplishing this was to set up intra-organizational disputes like the Hampton-Cleaver split, which resulted in fatalities straight down the line, or inter-organizational disputes, such as the cartoon campaign in the late 60s in LA between the Panthers. The FBI was putting out cartoons in style used by the Panthers. Not that they were identical with Emory Douglas's artwork, but taken in that style, mimeographed cartoons parodying the, well, they say it didn't mean United Slaves, but the US organization of Ron Karenga, cultural nationalists, as Karenga defined us, revolutionary nationalists, as the Panther Central Committee defined the Panthers agenda in LA. So the Panther forgeries ridiculed us, and they were also putting out cartoons in the name of us that ridiculed the Panthers. First immediate consequence of this was dispute at UCLA over who was going, either us or the Panthers, be the influential factor of the Black Students Union that was being formed there. There was a meeting on that very topic between attended both by us representatives and Bunchy Carter and John Huggins representing the Panthers. There were a couple of other people there that resulted in Bunchy and John getting shot to death. And then the entire LA Panther leadership, which had gathered at John Huggins' house to console his wife and child and basically to regroup, being arrested that night. This is the victim organization, if you want to use the vernacular of law enforcement. They arrested all the victims, nothing with regard to the perpetrator organization, which would be us. Turns out Claude Hubert, who was the actual trigger man there, was an FBI operative that was functioning in us, and also the two Steiner brothers. There's a fourth individual that was involved whose name I cannot recall, and he just disappeared. Hubert last known working for security services in Guyana. So he was consistent. He'd been moved to Guyana out of the United States, was never arrested. The Steiners were down there too. And then in Suriname, they had been arrested, sentenced for murder, and then walked out of San Quentin. Don't walk out of San Quentin. Anybody familiar with that prison? I mean, they just walked away and turned up in Guyana and Suriname. One of them finally wearied of, after several decades, being in Suriname, came back. I went to prison for a brief period. I think mainly for escaping under California law. And that's that. But that was major blow, obviously, to the LA Panthers. And the FBI took credit for it, took credit for the cartoons, said as a result that it was a successful operation, so successful that it should be continued, and it was, and more Panthers were killed by us members, and Ron Freeman was wounded by us members, and so on. So assassination inflicting fatalities and key people can happen in a number of different ways. I know of no instance where an FBI agent per se ever pulled a trigger. Police and other political activists were essentially conned into it. There's more that can be said. COINTELPRO began in '56 as a counter-subversive operation against the Communist Party, but expanded. The really intensive part begins in the late '60s. Although you'd had things like Bill Sullivan, who was basically in head of domestic security, under which COINTELPRO operation fell, concocted a set of tapes and so forth that were sent to the pack of Martin Luther King, suggesting that it would be sent to the press unless he was right. Basically committed suicide, took himself out, basically, was what they want. Be self-neutralizing. Now, that was obviously in the earlier '60s, but from 1968 onwards, you had this really intensive wave of counterintelligence operations directed at, well, the term was used, what they call black nationalist hate groups, black liberation movement, basically, in which they acknowledged 230 odd major 295 major operations targeting organizations and individuals, 230 of them aimed at the Black Panther Party. And it was ongoing, although the intensity had eased up in 1971 when a citizens commission to investigate the FBI, a clandestine group in Pennsylvania, pulled what was called a black bag job I mentioned earlier. That's a burglary, but their burglary was on an FBI resident agency in Media, Pennsylvania. They took all the files. Basically, it was a black bag job, only run in reverse. The FBI was short-circuited by that one. Really intensive search for the so-called, well, they were burglars. People were never apprehended, but they were putting the select documents as they analyzed the files out to the media, some of which contained that cryptonym, COINTELPRO, and people were starting to ask as a result of that, what the hell is COINTELPRO? And one thing follows another up to the church committee, where there is a lot of disclosure of what had been done, but also a lot of containment as to the extent of it. So the church committee is useful, the record that they were published in, I think, 6 volumes, official record, including a detailed account of the campaign to destroy the Black Panther Party. It's useful, puts it on record officially, hardly to be denied. The FBI documents cited in order to validate it by Congress. But, you know, there were key components left out, like they never concluded that some of those targeted were framed, didn't lead to a review of cases opening up people coming out of prison, and it did not acknowledge that there were actually assassinations involved. Like, pointed to the appearance that the FBI was trying to instigate. But in 1971, once that was out, the official story and the general narrative that's been put out is that COINTELPRO was officially terminated at that time. Well, not so. Use of the caption ended at that time. And there was considerable amount of drawdown in terms of the frequency of the operations, but even in the order to stop using the caption, J. Edgar Hoover himself said that there would be a tighter control level of authorization exerted such operations in the future. And in 1975-76, in their final report, Church Committee pointed out that they had uncovered at least 5 operations that appeared to carry the signature of COINTELPRO ongoing at the time, and they were intending to investigate those, but never did. COINTELPRO continued. Rather than talking about extremists, they started talking about terrorists, and so it's counterterrorism operations, and they've got a number of other captions, but the operations have continued right up to present. And what's being dealt with in terms of the raids nationwide, really, multiple city raids on the organization here, the Uhuru movement in general, is part of that. And if I had more time, I could link it back to the Palmer raids in 1919, 1920, multi-city raids targeting immigrant workers organizations and so forth. But I think what I will do is say that I have written up, as was pointed out, in a couple of books, along with a co-author, Jim Vanderwall, Agents of Repression and COINTELPRO papers, which were very recently republished, reprinted, whatever you want to call it, by Black Classic Press. So they're available. Those who want more detailed information, documents and all, take a look. Take a look. Yeah, I thank you all for listening to a long and perhaps useful presentation, and in the language of the particular moment, solidarity and Uhuru.